So I'm a human rights activist. I've been on the board of Human Rights Watch for many years. I also have worked a lot in the corporate world, leading McKinsey and Company's purpose and ESG practice, helping companies develop authentic ways to do good for society through responsible use of AI and other things. But I'm also the CEO of the Stephen Schwarzman Foundation, and Steve Schwarzman, the CEO of Blackstone, has invested about $500 million already in building institutes for AI and ethics, one at Oxford, and then the Schwarzman College of Computing at MIT, where the philosophy is, while these engineers are developing algorithms which will fundamentally change our society and literally tinker with our brains, let's teach them ethics. Let's ensure that they learn how to develop an ethics muscle and integrate Aristotle along with those algorithms for good. Now, AI, of course, is ubiquitous. It touches our lives in so many ways, for better or worse. It's already led to extraordinary advances, but there has been some collateral damage at the very least that's going to continue. How can the law keep up? The law, often seen as a turtle trying to chase after the sprinter AI and its use in so many ways. How can the law keep up? How can intergovernmental organizations cooperate more effectively on regulations in this area, developing regulations which work and do not just contribute to the alphabet soup out there of confusing frameworks that already exist? How can we ensure humans are both in charge, but also protected from certain uses of AI? And what must we ask of the private sector? Self-regulation has largely failed. We already heard a lambasting this morning from several participants on what the private sector is not doing. So what's next there? Perhaps increased employee activism will help carry the day, where the employees of these companies are stepping up and asking for more internally. Anyway, we have an amazing panel that's going to touch on these topics. Elisabeth Thomas-Reynaud, we'll start with her. She leads the secretariat for GPI, the leading G7 multi-stakeholder initiative, which is bridging the gap from theory to practice in this space. We have Dr. Marielza Oliveira, who is a senior leader at UNESCO. UNESCO playing an absolutely crucial role in advancing instruments for standard setting in AI. Cornelia Cutterer, who is the senior leader at Microsoft, which owns LinkedIn, of course, and can speak perhaps for the private sector and what can happen there. Christina Kolkloff, who represents workers and trade unions on GPI and is a founder of Why Not Lab. And then Patrick Pennings, who is a senior leader in the Council of Europe, Europe's leading human rights organization, and already having had some success with the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime a while back, which has now 65 signatory countries, and of course CAHI, the ad hoc committee on AI, already developing with some success some legal framework. We'll hear from Patrick too. Let's start by having each of the panelists open up on three questions. One, the role they play and the role their organizations play in developing practical solutions in the space of AI and human rights. Secondly, their views on how the law can keep up. What should the law do next to protect human rights? And then thirdly, a very practical question: is an international convention on AI worth developing? Should we go that route? If the price of consensus may be the exclusion of some areas like national security, where there's so many complexities out there on that topic. Let's lead that off with Elisabeth Thomas-Reynaud. Over to you, Elisabeth. Let's hear from you.
Hello, thank you very much, Bruce. And it's so great to be on this panel with many familiar faces. Nice to see you all and to be participating today. Thank you for our hosts for having us. You've heard a little bit about GPay, the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. I'm going to try and capture for you a little bit about what we're doing. It's a unique entity. It's not necessarily what everyone imagines on first blush. It's a values-based initiative. It was built around a shared commitment to the OECD recommendation on artificial intelligence. It was launched in June 2020 with 15 founding members, and it has since grown to 25 members. GPay brings together leading experts from science, industry, civil society, governments, international organizations, all to foster international cooperation. As Bruce mentioned, it's aiming to bridge this gap between theory and practice on AI, and it means to do that through cutting-edge research and applied activities on AI-related priorities. GPay is aiming to provide a mechanism for shared multidisciplinary research and to identify key issues among AI practitioners. Its objective here is to facilitate this international collaboration, to reduce duplication, to act as a global reference point for specific AI issues, and ultimately to promote trust in and adoption of trustworthy AI. So how's GPay doing this? Its members identified 4 important topic areas for experts to collaborate, around which make the 4 working groups of GPay. Responsible AI, which has a subgroup working on AI and pandemics, data governance, future of work, innovation and commercialization. In these groups, GPay experts assess on a comprehensive, objective, open and transparent basis the scientific, technical and socioeconomic information that's relevant to understanding AI impacts. GPay experts' outputs are aiming to encourage responsible development of AI and offer insights and options for adaptation and mitigation of potential risks. For example, in the data governance group, there are projects on data trusts, there's work on data justice, and a new proposal on privacy enhancing technologies. In the future of work, GPay experts are designing and experimenting with living labs to better understand what might be the impact of AI in the workplace. So what are the member countries seeking from GPay and how can it help them? Member countries have noted the benefit for them in a shared global understanding of the key AI-related priorities across science, innovation, governance, and they're keen to share access to globally leading expertise and project-based initiatives that facilitate and progress global AI capacity, readiness, and capability. They've affirmed a commitment to a like-minded values-based cooperation, and they have since been setting up GPay processes in these early years that reinforce this, so that all members, experts, and anyone engaging with GPay must agree to uphold the shared values. Experts are independent in their research, but the selection of projects is oriented and approved by GPay members to advance these goals. Most recently, the GPay Council identified the impact on human rights, including gender equality, inclusiveness, and factoring AI's potential to impact those with disabilities as one of its 3 key priorities to orient future GPay expert projects. On the question of, I think your second question, or one of your questions, I'm sorry, I think I might have missed your second question, but on the third question.
Second question was simply, how can the law keep up? And then what's kind of the next move we should make? But then particularly, is an international convention a good idea? Should we move in that direction? By the way, we will, so a call out, we're going to be asking the audience the same question after the panelists have opened up here. So we will be launching a poll, but that was the third.
Thank you. So I think in terms of keeping, or at least the role for GPay to play in helping the law keep up is really, it's not going to be the lawmaker. There's other places where that's happening, but GPay's hopefully in due course, because it's early days for us still, but in due course, we really hope that the work of the experts provides input and insights and understanding, really deepens that sense for what, how do those levers work, what are the impacts, and to get a bit more nuanced perspective on AI and its relationship to humans and how to facilitate that road. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of this particular project and the pursuit of the governments involved. I will say that is in terms of what other alternatives are out there or should be pursued. I'll leave that for the governments themselves to express. But what I see inside GPay is that the governments are focused on implementing this approach of international cooperation that is framed on the recommendations. So they're looking at encouraging multi-stakeholder initiatives, collecting an evidence base that can help them assess the implementation of principles. And through GPay, these governments are looking for that understanding of trying to upscale some good examples and invest in the kind of research activities that would provide practical options for anticipating and mitigating issues. And again, I mentioned some of the examples already that are going on in the workplace activities. So I think these are ways in which GPay hopes to make this contribution.
Okay, International Convention on AI, worth developing or not? Particularly the price of consensus maybe to exclude some important areas. Yes, no?
It might be too soon.
Thank you. Marielsa, let's go to you. Over to you. Talk for UNESCO and, of course, the important role you play.
Thank you very much. And first of all, apologies for having to deal with Pink Me. I'm calling from Poland, from a hotel room while I attend the Internet Governance Forum. And lightning is the worst, you know. So at least I hope you're listening to me or can hear me, you know. But get Pink Me, you know, right now. So sorry about that. Well, first, hello, and thank you, Bruce, for the invitation. Hello, everyone. My name is Marielsa Oliveira. I'm the UNESCO Director in charge of the Communications and Information teams, including the one that works on digital innovation and transformation, which is essential for us, you know. So artificial intelligence is being used in such a growing number of decisions in a variety of domains that we pay very special attention to this technology because of its effects on human rights. It not only affects, you know, of course, freedom of expression, access to information, privacy, but the AI actually mediates our access to education, to health, to justice, to culture, to decent work, to many of our other human rights. So we can, you know, and of course, it can accelerate achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. It can enable those rights. But like any new technology, it has flaws, it has vulnerabilities, it may lead to individual and social harms. So, you know, from our perspective, you know, the point is to really place effective, legitimate governance mechanisms that can guide AI-based innovation and contribute to sustainable development in a way that upholds human rights. So this is what we do, and we look at that in two complementary ways. You know, first, through fostering shared standards for self-regulation. For example, you know, a few weeks ago, UNESCO member states adopted the world's first global AI ethics recommendation, which is a voluntary framework for protection of human rights and dignity, and demonstrate that we can actually agree on global principles. It's a major achievement and a step forward to have agreed to that. But we can't rely solely on voluntary arrangements. There is a role for regulation too, and its role is essentially on the prevention, the mitigation, the redressing of violation to human rights. That you know, a philosophy or a mantra of moving fast and breaking things inevitably causes. You know, moving fast means that we actually need regulatory frameworks that are fast moving too. You know, so we're looking at agile mechanisms that can protect the public interest while still keeping pace with AI innovation. It can actually even help to foster innovation by reducing regulatory uncertainty, which in turn promotes new AI investment. So, I mean, regulation, this dichotomy between, you know, regulation and innovation, we see that as a false dichotomy. You know, I think one thing supports the other. You know, on the side of the breaking things, that you know, it means that we actually need real accountability for when things get broken. And in legal terms, that means adapting legal principles such as intention, culpability, negligence to the you know, AI environment. The point is to develop, you know, explainable, trustworthy, transparent, responsible AI. And regulation should actually prevent intentional harms systems from being deployed, foster reasonable efforts to detect and prevent potential harm in other systems, and define appropriate measures if harms actually happen. What is the consequence of harm? The ultimate ingredient is not actually regulation, is the capacity to enforce legal frameworks. So for us, the support we provide is actually strengthening capacities of both duty bearers and rights holders, to actually engage, with AI. So on the duty bearer side, we've trained over 23,000 judicial operators in over 150 countries on international standards of freedom of expression in relation to artificial intelligence, using massive open online courses, webinars, on-the-ground training, workshops, kits, guidelines, repositories. We need to build their capacity to actually not only regulate, but actually enforce regulation. And on the side of rights holders, we focus on building their capacities for safeguarding their own rights. We launched, for example, a new online course on AI and human rights for young people, where experts explain complex concepts about AI and enable them and how to protect their own rights. We're looking at it on both ways, and I actually invite you to check out UNESCO's website for that. Now, on your two other questions, where should the law go, or the regulation go? I think we need global standards. Absolutely need global standards, legal standards that are based on fundamental, universal values and principles. Of course, it may be too early, but it's never too early to actually start collaboration and cooperation in that aspect. In exchanging, lessons learned on what actually happens when different legal frameworks are implemented and enforced in different contexts. And of course, to me, the next step is actually to build capacities of all countries to actually engage productively in this kind of conversation, because there is a tremendous inequality in capacities to actually dialogue about regulation, simply because some countries are technologically more advanced than others. Some have critical mass, in terms of having the numbers of technology people, regulators, and so on, and others don't. Some are at the forefront of investments, and others are, recipient of this technology. So we need to actually bring all voices to the table, compare, experiences, trade those experiences, share those experiences, so that we can actually start advancing towards, this kind of global framework, and to understand the different types of harms that can happen in different environments when different groups are excluded or included. So, and are we there yet on a global framework? Maybe not, but we should be on the way, I think. And our ethics frameworks just show that we can do that.
So you'd be a yes on that third question, but it may take a while to get there. This idea of having an international convention on AI.
I think we should get, be on the way for that. We should start thinking about how do we get there and what do we need, what capacities, who we should have around the table to get there. Yeah.
Excellent. Cornelia, go ahead.
Thanks. Also from my end, thank you very much for having me on this wonderful panel. I'm also extremely interested in the chat, which is extremely lively on the side note. So a great discussion on the chat side as well. I will start with the first question. What we are doing, and obviously it has been made quite easy for me, as we had Brad as a keynote speaker just earlier on, who already referred a little bit to how we have been working on our ethical principles over the last couple of years. And he in particular mentioned the standard version 2, which is now which we released in September and which our engineering groups have to follow. But it's a part of the overall AI governance structure that we have been building up over the last couple of years, which includes our Office of Responsible AI, that is in particular responsible for developing the standard for our engineering and sales groups. It also has a system of review sensitive uses that engineering groups have to put forward. I'll come back to that in a second. And of course, the team also engages in the policy discussions, be it with the GPAI or OECD or the Council of Europe or elsewhere in the world. We do have the Ether group, which is our engineering and research group. There, our really smart people sit that do the data science and do actually think through these ethical principles and how we can operationalize. What does it mean to have transparency in AI systems? And for whom do you need to be transparent? How do you develop tools for transparency or accountability? We have a third group, which is fairly new. It's called RAISE. That group is actually building the tools. So not only do we have practices and transparency notes for our customers, we are now also building tools for our customers to make those principles easier in practice. They are built in our platforms, Azure platform, so that our customers can effectively apply transparency, apply fairness metrics or fairness checks when they are deploying AI systems. All over, the AI governance is really led by our senior leadership with the AI Council that gives the directions to this overall responsible AI governance. Brad mentioned the standards, and just to say that each ethical principle has a list of goals in the standard that the engineering groups have to adhere to. So when you think about accountability, starting off with an impact assessment, or thinking about the maturity of a specific AI system, is it or not, specific risks and the mitigations around them. The data governance, of course, is part of it. Data sheets for data sets, in particular in the context of training data, and so on, so on. I don't want to run you through the whole standard now, it would take too long, but just to say it's really goal-oriented and process-based, so that there is a process-oriented mechanism for in operationalizing these principles. From that learning also, and the learnings we have from putting these AI standards into practice, this is sort of our starting point when we engage in the debates around, be it the convention or the CAHI group, or at the OECD level, in particular for me, in the context of the European AI Act. Because that is where we have the full understanding of the challenges that our engineers meet when they are confronted with like terms such as accuracy of data or error-free data that they should try to achieve. And we want to have an engagement around these more practical issues and how you're actually doing it. The law keeping up, I'll take this from a bit of a, and Patrick, you can afterwards correct me if I'm saying anything wrong here, but I'm taking this from a very European perspective. I'm a European lawyer. We are living in a region which is framed by human rights, and so at a high level principle based, we do have rules that apply to the technology already, and so now it is really up to how to specify these rules, in particular for the public sector, but also for the companies that are either developing the technologies or deploying the technologies. So the governments here, I think, are asked and have an institutional duty, as Paul Nemitz also underlined, that to put these protections in place where they are necessary. The AI Act, of course, is sort of the first, and we are looking very closely at it. We have welcomed the leadership that the European Commission has taken. And of course, now it's about how do you strengthen the current draft in order to make it really happen. And this brings me a little bit to the International Convention. Of course, we've seen a lot of initiatives around the world with principles and standards. I think the OECD definitely plays a role in standard setting. But as Bruce, you have mentioned, the Council of Europe has some track record in providing standards, international law through conventions that really speak to these rule of law, human rights aspects. And as far as I have seen as an observer in the Kahai work, what speaks to the approach the Kahai experts have taken is that really there is obligations for all stakeholders, but also in particular stakeholders from the government, because the human rights issues very often occur, of course, in this interrelation. We always have to think about the triangle between the business, the government, and the citizens in this space. And so there's a really interesting angle to that. So yes, I think international conventions make a lot of sense in this space, precisely to think through the human rights frameworks that we have, whether that be at the Council of Europe level and conventions are open to be exceeded there, or whether it's at another international level. So from our end, I think, yes, that should be at least in parallel to be pursued next to sectoral or horizontal rules that are built on regional or national level.
Thank you. Christina.
Thank you, Bruce. And fascinating to hear all of you speak, and it's changing what I had thought I was going to say. But let me take your questions. And as usual, and Elizabeth, you're going to laugh now, I will do it in reverse order. Should there be a convention? You ask in singular. No, there should be many. And this is the thing. We need to, I mean, there's lots and lots of comments in the chat here about the complexity of all of this. Well, no, let's peel the layers off the onion here and then really start looking at the core features of artificial intelligence, its deployment in the public, the private, and in workplaces, and see where is it that we need actually to have some conventions. And these could be around transparency, around the co-governance, around the co-design of algorithmic systems to ensure that they do not intentionally or unintentionally harm. So that's number one. But what do I do about all of this? Now, I agree with most of what my fellow speakers have said, but I really think we need to start from the ground up here. And what I do in the work in the Why Not Lab is really work with workers and unions across the world in all regions to bridge a huge gap, knowledge gap here, and that is around data, around AI, algorithms. How do we understand these new technologies that are being introduced into workplaces, and how then on that understanding can workers and unions start building a response to this, and to really with the ultimate aim to tabling an alternative digital ethos. Now, this leads into the idea of a convention. What we are seeing now is several things in workplaces, and I'm going to limit my comments to the workplaces. What we see is that management are introducing tools and systems which for the vast, vast majority are third-party systems. They have not necessarily been trained in identifying harms, risks, in understanding what could be the unintended consequences of the use of these systems in terms of violation of discrimination and bias and so forth, but also lots of other harms we can see workers are subject to now, increased work speed, intensity, etc., etc. So what we see here is that management are introducing these systems and they are not governing them. And if they are governing them at all, it's from a risk perspective, risk of being hacked or safety or something. It's not from a social technical perspective. So one of the things that the Why Not Lab is helping the unions with is actually starting that conversation with management around how could we co-govern these systems, not to remove the responsibility and liability from management, but actually to ensure that management does take that responsibility seriously. So the empowerment from the ground up, I think, is extremely essential, and really in relation to lots of the comments from participants here around, but there's so many digital divides. How do we bridge them? Can law keep up? Now, this is a question which is almost fixating law as a constant. Now, law, it can be kept up if our politicians took responsibility. Now, we are standing, and I said this when I bowed out of the GPI steering committee, we are standing on the shoulders of giants, politicians who before in history dared take responsibility. And I think the world is now looking at the current global politicians to say, take responsibility. Let's face it, the current digital ethos, which is running around the world right now, is doing more harm than good. And this, I think, especially in a human rights perspective, if you look and you read that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has formed the basis for many human rights laws around the world, is so profound. And I really want to support what Maria Elsa said, we just have to enforce these absolute rights, freedom of thought. Now, thinking that through, at the moment, so many, both workers, citizens, of course, are being manipulated to a degree that do they really have a freedom of thought? How is this being manifested in relation to their work opportunities, for example? Are we narrowing the labor market into very inclusive, exclusive labor markets where anything outside of the norm is a priori thrown out the window? And then I really want to say something, because I am, if I can be so crude, really, really tired of hearing governments and high politicians talk about how they respect human rights, and yet they are allowing the abuse of human rights within their borders, just in the world of work, union busting, for example. This is abuse of human rights. So I really think we should tidy up our own backyards and then acknowledge we don't just need one international convention. We need several, and we need to break this down into the very core of artificial intelligence, or whatever you want to call it, algorithmic systems, so that it is a co-building, a co-governance of these systems, no matter where they are deployed.
Excellent. Thanks, Christina. We're going to come back to you, by the way, on your views on the AI Act and how it's what needs to be added, perhaps, in order that individuals be well protected. Patrick, bring us home on this first round, and then we're going to go to a poll to get the audience input and then open up a little bit. You're on mute, Patrick.
So thank you. I will try to dismantle a little bit what has already been said. I want to go beyond ethics, Bruce. We are beyond ethics. Technology has put us, or puts us, in front of a societal choice right now, and we can believe and try to continue to be idealistic, etc. But we see that we are confronted with human rights skepticism, and that we are facing throughout the world a democratic backsliding. And unfortunately, the digital developments do not necessarily help us with that. I think that Brad, but also Paul Nemitz, spoke about the societal choice, the human-centered artificial intelligence, where the amicus democraticus has to take the overhand, where we need to be able to go towards an interpretation of artificial intelligence. There's a very good book written by Christine Mölnar, who writes about artificial intelligence interpreters. How do we make sure that artificial intelligence is understood? It's not only any longer a question of public and private, as also Karina Shu said. It's about people, public, private, and private includes also technology and the technological development, which is not neutral. That's my first point. My second point is we should avoid a patchwork of artificial intelligence regulation. And there we need to integrate existing frameworks, whether that is in one convention or a plurality of conventions and other frameworks, whether that be soft law or hard law. I think we should avoid a patchwork of artificial intelligence regulations. We need, and that's my third point, we need a clear framework which is applicable at a global level. I saw in the chat reference to the Cybercrime Convention. Indeed, it is now been ratified by 66 states throughout the world, but about 130 countries align themselves to the Cybercrime Convention. Why do they do so? Because the Cybercrime Convention is not only a law enforcement convention, it is also a convention which is embedded in a number of democratic, human rights, and rule of law principles. My fourth element is that the Council of Europe, an intergovernmental institution, the oldest political institution in Europe with 47 member states, opted to develop a legal framework based on those values: human rights, rule of law, and democracy. So that's the answer to your third question, Bruce. And as also Goxe Heisel said in the chat, the problem is not designing the principles, but it is implementing and assessing these principles. And the human rights and artificial intelligence framework I was speaking about that the Council of Europe has been developing has to its connected the so-called Huderia principles. That is, how do we translate those principles that everyone seems to agree upon, elements such as the prevention of unlawful harm, equal treatment and non-discrimination, data governance for AI system, robustness, safety, cybersecurity, transparency, explainability, auditability, and you name it. How do we translate them? And we've worked together with the Alan Turing Institute to make it more concrete, to make it applicable, because, and that's why I say we're beyond the ethical frameworks. And we do work together with the European Commission, UNESCO, OECD, in order to put all of our knowledge together, but we have to go a step further. And we need to clearly benchmark those principles in the AI development. And that can be by a framework convention, which clearly outlines what these thresholds are that we have to respond to in order to be able to develop a system which is for the human good, as we all agree upon.
Excellent. Well, what great openers. And we could spend all day on this. I'd love to bring the poll up, Katerina, if you could do that. And let's see what the audience thinks about that third question. How beneficial would an international convention on AI and human rights be if it excluded entire sectors such as national security? Now, of course, it's you could ask the question slightly differently. I guess we'll take it as a given that most people would support some kind of international convention, or many. But what's your answer to the question that we have here? And by the way, hats off to the audience for keeping this chat going. It's fabulous what we're seeing in the chat. So I'm following that. So if you guys out there, the audience, could give a single choice to this question, that would be fun. And then Katerina, when you have the results, you can bring those up on screen. With one eye on the clock, I'd love to bring it down a level to the corporate side of things. So while we are beavering away in multiple venues, developing regulations, frameworks, and so on, it would be great, wouldn't it, if companies were to step up and stand and deliver in terms of shifting from what they're saying to action. There are some ideas out there. For example, if companies like Microsoft, Google, etc., Facebook were to certify certain algorithms or systems or processes following some kind of a clinical trial that they could do on a subset of the population, maybe there's some legal protection for that openness. But certifying systems is one idea. Certifying individuals This is the idea of coaching and training and then certifying individuals have actually passed at least an exam on ethics. Letting the researchers in. Researchers the world over clamor to get access to the data that that big tech has on the harm or the positive side of what's happening out there. Allowing more transparency, allowing the researchers in, that would be helpful. Or the big one in the US, for example, should the law shift from making social media platforms from being newsstands to being publishers, with a shift in the obligation of social media companies. As a newsstand, of course, it's very different. If you're a publisher, however, a much higher burden of care in terms of the impact that what is being published on your platform, the impact it's having out there. So I throw out there a few ideas. Let's start with you, Cornelia. Thoughts on what companies can do more? Are we on a good trajectory, or is there a big step up required? And I know Microsoft is seen as the good guys on this to some extent, but if you can speak for big tech more generally.
Yeah, so First of all, there were many questions in this one question. So trying to unfold this a little bit and put it in pieces to be able to answer. Maybe first on certification or certifying people. I think we are probably at the early stages of this development. It's part of the current discussion on legislation. Take, for example, the EU AI Act, where clearly part of the system will be standards against which you can self-assess or be audited against. And CENELEC, the European Standards Organization, has started its work to think through these issues. Of course, ISO is also developing standards in relation to governance models. As far as this is not happening and laws are not yet in place, that is one of the reasons that companies like Microsoft has started to build out their own AI governance model and the standards that I was referring to earlier. We also, and I very much agree, what we also need is, of course, the training and the shift in mindset, in particular of the engineers, in thinking through the issues and this broader concepts of, why are we building the technology? What is it for? Who do we serve with the technology, and who might we actually negatively impact? That is kind of a new model for many of the engineers. So a lot of training goes into this. And then you're shifting, and I don't want to avoid those questions at all. You're shifting to more the social media companies. Microsoft, as you pointed out, has LinkedIn, which is, as we describe, another general purpose social media, very much focused on a specific audience with a specific business model that is also different in many ways from the typical business model that general purpose social media have. And so I take this a little bit apart. What we have, of course, seen is that companies in that space need to step up on their responsibilities, but also governments have started to actually step up. We've heard earlier the US Senator talking about that and what's happening in the US. And of course, in Europe, we have a very active debate on the Digital Services Act that tries precisely to frame more due diligence into the systems as far as companies haven't lived up to their obligations, you call it ethical or rule of law obligations. In that space, though, and I think that is still a very active debate, and we've had this in numerous other countries, like in Germany with the Netzdurchführungsgesetz, a specific law, where there is a lot of debate around how far companies should go, what type of rules are put in place, and what is the effect of those in, for example, over indexing specific context, taking content down that shouldn't be taken down. And this is a very fierceful debate in what the right balance on human rights is. And so if this more bold or radical suggestions, such as let's make social media, let's treat them like media and no longer like platforms, if we go through this thought process, let's make sure that we really understand what the potential impacts would be on the ecosystem on those platforms. I don't have a definitive answer to that, but what we can say in this context, let's also make sure, and what we're talking about in that space in particular, is the harm that was created through, I think it was Paul Nemitz mentioning this, that the business model has fostered the intention to disinformation, because as humans we are always focusing on the scandals and the issues and so on and so forth. Here, I think we need to think through a couple of themes. First of all, how can we diminish this, and how can we be better in timing the system towards authoritative content? For example, in COVID, we have some good examples with that. But more than that, I think, how do we support journalism and publishers so that they have business models that can elevate their importance?
Exactly. Thank you. By the way, Katerina, bring the results of the poll up once you actually have the data. Here we go. So interesting. So in answer to the question, how beneficial would an international convention on AI and human rights be if it included entire sectors such as national security? We have a majority, it looks like, well, no, with 49%, it's not a majority, but it's at the highest vote, say somewhat beneficial. And so I guess what we're saying, it's at least a base hit, if you like to use an American term. But there is a significant minority there, 24%, who would say not beneficial if we're going to exclude national security. I mean, for goodness sake, that is the area where we might be most concerned. But the majority here, at least moving in this direction of at least somewhat beneficial. So there's more work to do, but I would read that if you add the 49 and 27 together, it's beneficial or somewhat beneficial. Let's stick with the company side of things. Christina, I'm sure you have some things you want to add on that topic of how companies can step up more. Please.
Absolutely, I absolutely do. And just a comment on that question, and I was happy I could not ask or respond to the poll, because the way it was, putting my doctor hat on here, the way it was phrased was so biased that I don't really think that you can trust those responses. Anyhow, to the companies, now let's just look at this.
What question would you have asked, Christina? Because we have the chat.
That's another chat. I've got more important things to say. Right?
Ask your question. We'll get the chat inputs on that one. Go ahead.
No, but I mean, Cornelia, now I'm lovingly looking at you, right? In everything that Microsoft has done, have you included a representative sample of your employees in forming those policies or practices that you have? Do you regularly check in with them around lived harms, lived experiences, and so forth? What companies could do is bring dialogue back into vogue, to stop perceiving their employees as their enemies, to really value that the union representatives or the workers themselves have the ear to the ground. They are the ones who are living the impacts, or in the majority of cases, the harms that these systems are subjecting them to. And I am so frustrated in almost every single governance model that has been produced from academia, experts, think tanks. There is an assumption in them that management knows what they're dealing with, and they don't. And this is a fallacy. The majority of companies I've spoken to who are deploying third-party systems do not know how to govern these systems in a social technical environment. So we need to bring dialogue back into vogue. That is one thing. Second thing, what can companies do? Respect the collective agreements, respect the human rights, the freedom of association, the right to collective bargaining, and through collective agreements start actually discussing some of these, the implementation, the purposes of these systems. my third point is, and this is another mind-boggling thing about international law, including the EU AI Act. If you certify a tool, you are also certifying it as it is at the time of certification. I don't think you need to be much of a technical expert to know that the majority of these systems either self-learn, they're machine learning, or get adapted because the instructions to the algorithms get changed or whatever. You cannot certify once. We need this, and here I think if Paul Niewitz is still on the call, one of the genius things of the GDPR, although not many are living up to this, is the periodic reassessment of data protection impact assessments, for example. This we need to understand. We need to periodically reassess these systems. And you cannot, nobody can, justifiably, unilaterally do this. You have to do this with stakeholders, multiple stakeholders at the table. So what can companies do? That's it. You co-govern these systems, take their responsibility, educate themselves so they know what they're actually dealing with, and periodically commit to the reassessment and the commitment to, if harms are being experienced, to throw the system out the window if it cannot be adjusted.
And add there too, I'm sure you would agree with this, Christina, but when we're focused on laws and legislations, it very often is focusing on the outlying activity. It's focusing on that line in the sand beyond which negative things will happen with penalties and so on. The trouble is that behaviors can move too much to that line in the sand and then dial it back a little bit. We also need, the big tech to step up and say, here's a great way of doing it. Let's not wait to be regulated. We'll do some of the things that you describe, which would be best practices, so we can get people to behave more in the right way, as opposed to just not doing anything that is...
Bruce, I would love that. But how many of the big tech companies coming out of your country have a tradition of collective agreements and positive, constructive dialogue with their employees? None. So I don't think the best practice is going to come from them.
No, I totally agree. But there are a few, though. There are a few. Give them credit, but it is not standard at all. Okay, no. Cornelia, you wanted to write a reply on that one, or do you put the?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Just
quickly, if you can. Very quickly.
Very quickly. I do actually agree, Christina, with what you are saying, and I think this is particular, and the reference you're making to the EU AI Act. I think the problem that we are facing with the EU AI Act is that it's based on product safety legislation, but here we are actually dealing with socio-technical issues, both already in the development, but in particular in the deployment of the AI system. And hence, we have argued that we need to focus also on the governance accountability of those who are actually using the AI technology. We need a transparency and accountability so that potentially impacted citizens, be it citizens, employees, customers, or consumers, have even the ability to engage. So I'm in agreement with what you were saying.
So on the AI Act, with an eye on the clock, folks, comments on that. So what more could the AI Act do? It's a leading legislation that's being pushed through right now. Patrick, comments on that? If you think about individual human rights and the way legislation is going in that particular piece of legislation, there's so much criticism coming from from groups all over Europe on the insufficient protection to individual rights in that piece of legislation. Are there ways to fix it? Comments that you would have, please.
Well, I would say, of course, I mentioned the different international organizations. Some of them are around the table here, like UNESCO. We take the AI developments from different angles, and I will not. I mean, it is up to the European Union now to work on, for example, product safety from their angle. For us, our key take is really from a human rights perspective, and that is what stands out, and where Christina says we cannot necessarily catch up with the developments in the digital developments that are taking place. That's why we need to set benchmarks, and that's why we need to have a societal discussion on where we want to go first. And I would not give too much role, not too little, because we have a strong partnership with business, including Microsoft, between business and the Council of Europe. But that does not mean that business needs to make the societal choices. The societal choices need to be made by society, and
Yes.
those include the people, the public, the private, also the technical world. I think it's important. They have long been sidelined in a way, even though included in the development of artificial intelligence, but not really brought to the impact of what the development that they're doing actually has a human rights impact, and that we need to mend. Not too much responsibility for companies, I would say, and not too little. We definitely need to make sure companies are also asking for this orientation, for this societal orientation. You heard Brad about facial recognition. Facial recognition is not a neutral technology. And then you can authenticate and certify, and you can do whatever you like. Ultimately, it is about what is the use that is going to be made of this. And that use has to be given by the society, and has to be given where we want to go with the technological possibilities that are out there. What are we going to do with those in terms of reaching the human good, so to say?
Good. Marielza, and then I'll come to you, Elizabeth, just after. So where do you think the line should be drawn? For example, in the AI Act, some would say, look, there should be an outright ban. All scoring approaches, all biometric surveillance should be out. There should be an obligation on explainability. And the Act is very light on remedies, with carrying a bigger stick. Any comments on this and how to make this legislation be successful?
Well, I mean, I have to agree that there are certain technologies and certain types of systems that really, need to be outright banned. So some of them, like for example, Secretary General Antonio Guterres actually said something like, there is no place in a civilized world for autonomous weapon systems. Human Rights Commissioner Michelle Bachelet called a moratorium on the use of facial recognition technology, including particularly during peaceful protests, stressing that it can increase discrimination, particularly against people of African descent and other minorities. There are certain systems that are simply morally wrong, and if they're morally wrong, they're violating rights. This is not, we should not be allowing them. If we are going to be, permitting, certain elements to continue to be used, or certain systems to continue to be used, there should be, a real, not permit. I mean, if we have these systems continually in use, there should be serious consequences for those, because they are really discriminatory systems that are used against specific people, and they are causing very specific harms. We know that, and so those harms have to have consequences, and that's what I'm talking about. So, there's certain types of systems that I don't believe that should be out there, and that there can be, particular improvements. We may not, all agree on that, but this is my own personal stance. I see Christina raise her hand over there, so jump in, Christina.
Yeah, and then we'll go to Elizabeth right after Christina. Go ahead, Christina. You've got something on that one there.
Yeah, I know, I do. I just want to very, very quickly say that all algorithmic systems are harming certain people, certain groups, certain countries, certain this. So when is a harm big enough for it to lead to a ban? Right? I just think we have to turn this upside down and say we cannot introduce any algorithmic system if it is not governed. And it has to be governed by those who are subject to its harms or impacts. So that's how I would turn it around. And just on the EU AI Act, can you imagine they come out with a draft EU AI Act and they don't mention workers with one single word. They admit that systems introduced in workplaces are high-risk systems, yet they shy away from any form of governance saying self-assessment, self-regulation is good enough. Yeah. This is an absolute disaster, and why they moved away from the rights-based GDPR to risk-based EU AI Act, I do not understand, and it has to be redone totally.
Great comment. So Elizabeth, I mean, can the workers of the world unite, so to speak, at this point with GPI? Can GPI be a vehicle that can help bring these different groups of people to bear, individuals and companies and intergovernment organizations? Maybe just, or perhaps GPI necessary, not sufficient? Just very, very quick comments, and then we'll do a quick round after. 30 seconds from each of you before we have to close. Elizabeth.
Sure. So actually your question kind of went to where I wanted to go, because I think we've talked a lot about protection, and protection is super important, and my colleagues have covered that very well. I think what we've missed, speaking a bit more about, is empowerment. And I think GPA has a really important role to play in empowerment. I think you can have the best rules ever. I think back to an analogy somebody gave me about children and online engagement, is that you can prevent them from getting online, but then you prevent them from having the capacity and the ability to engage in their futures. And I think it's a similar kind of thing with artificial intelligence. And I think of what Christina was talking about with her actual work and how she does that. GPA's got this potential to I think upscale those kind of activities to bring that in, those insights, to test and challenge them, and then have the governments take them and spread them out and really invest them in improving AI systems. So I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle, and I very much hope GPA can realize its ambitions on that.
I love that concept of empowerment. Yes, Marielta, closing comments.
Can I jump in? You know, like just because Christina asked one question: where do we draw the line? I draw the line at systems that sell violation of human rights as a service. You know, that's essentially, you know, surveillance is a violation of privacy, which is a human right, and it's a service that is being provided. You know, one thing is for a system to actually cause harm, you know, to certain groups. Sometimes it's unintended, but this one is beyond that. It's an absolutely intended profit-making violation of human rights service, you know, and that's, I think, where a line needs to be drawn. I would take a provocative, you know, stance as well and say, you know, any system for which we can not yet predict or foresee consequences, impacts on human dignity and human rights should not be deployed until the time at when this analysis can be completed and any harms mitigated. But the law, you know, but the line is actually selling these violations as a service. You know, that to me is beyond the pale. You know, so just to answer that question that Christina put in, you know.
And we're going to be shut in 1 second by the boss here, by Nicola, but closing comment, if you like, from Patrick. Quick closing comment.
Yes, I believe that we should recognize the potential of AI development. That is the first thing, and that we should foster that and not stifle it. That's one thing. At the same time, we should be aware of the risks that are involved in that, and those risks, they need to be regulated.
Cornelia, last comment, and then Christina will go to you at the very end.
Yeah, I want to pick up one thought of Brad that he mentioned in his statement. That is that we need to be creative in how these rules are governed. And one thought to that is, as I look at the EU AI Act, and maybe this is also important, as you know, the Council of Europe is working towards its convention. The challenge we have is that we are always starting from what we know, hence EU AI Act and product safety legislation. But we really need to think that AI is different, as it is data correlation mainly. So we need to be humble in thinking about how we can address in the process, in the life cycle, but also in the law, acknowledge that we are dealing with socio-technical issues. So we need to really be creative in reformulating the requirements that both the deployers and the developers should be obliged to have, and we shouldn't make the developer, the user of the AI, just following instructions. No, the users, which is often public sector, have their governance model as well. And this is again what Christina was also saying. We need this life cycle of accountability around the system.
Well, fully agree. And there was a good chat there too. It's not just the algorithm developers, it's the whole company. And perhaps there's meat in the concept that, well, we need to protect the freedom of expression and so on. At the same time, if the exercise of that right leads to a negative impact in somebody else, then the obligation comes with the right. That needs to be looked at. And the concept of empowerment, I thought, was very helpful too there from Elizabeth. Christina, you get the last word.
Thanks. Oh, I could go on with you guys forever. This is so great. No, I would like to pose a question in the end. There are lots of responsible technologies which are being produced, which are very underfunded and so forth. AI could do a hell of a lot of good in relation to the world of work. Where and why is this responsible technology not being funded? If people really and governments really were committed to human rights, there would be funding towards responsible tech. And then I just want to end by quoting Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and remind us all that all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And this, I think, we should commit ourselves to uphold.
And on that note, over to our sponsor.